Swapped is a 2026 American animated fantasy adventure comedy film. It was released on Netflix and in select theaters on May 1, 2026, and received mixed reviews from critics. The film comes from a production company called Skydance Animation and is distributed by Netflix globally. It has a runtime of 1 hour and 42 minutes and carries a PG rating, making it a family-friendly film suitable for all age groups, though it carries enough depth and emotional weight to engage adult viewers as well. This is an American production, built out of the United States, and it represents a significant collaboration between Skydance Animation's American and European divisions, particularly involving Skydance Animation Madrid, which played a key role in delivering the final film. The movie was originally developed under the title Powerless, then went through another working title called Puku, before eventually being renamed Swapped ahead of its 2026 release. So this is a project that went through nearly 8 years of development before it finally reached audiences. The film is directed by Nathan Greno, who is best known for co-directing the beloved Disney animated film Tangled back in 2010. The screenplay was written by John Whittington, who previously wrote the Lego Batman movie, along with writing partners Christian Margulies and Robert Snow, who are known for their work on DuckTales and Wanla. The story was co-developed by Greno himself along with Adam Karp. The producers on the project include the legendary John Lasseter, the former chief creative officer of both Pixar and Walt Disney Animation Studios, alongside David Ellison, Dana Goldberg, and Mary Ellen Bowder Andrews. The film's score was composed by Siddhartha Khosla, who brings a rich and emotionally resonant musical backdrop to the world of the Valley. Nathan Greno spoke openly about his creative vision for this project. He described Swapped as a body-swap movie unlike anything audiences have seen before, set in a world where the creatures of the valley exist on a spectrum between plant and animal, creating a wild and completely original ecosystem. He also mentioned that the creative team drew significant inspiration from live-action nature documentaries, studying the complexity of real-world ecosystems to capture something that feels both vibrant and deeply human despite being entirely animated and fantastical. Plot details. Now let us get into the story itself, and there is genuinely a lot to unpack here because this film builds an entirely original world completely from scratch, which is one of its most impressive qualities. The story takes place in a magical land called the Valley, a lush and extraordinary environment populated by animal-plant hybrid creatures. Among the many species that inhabit this world, one particular group called the puka lives on an island in the middle of the valley's river. The puka are small, sea otter-like creatures who have lived in isolation and fear for generations, warned never to venture beyond their island and never to interact with the other species of the valley. At the center of the story is a young puka named Ali, voiced by Michael B. Jordan. Ali is different from the rest of his kind. He is deeply curious, adventurous by nature, and constantly drawn to the world beyond his island, despite the warnings of his parents and his grandmother. His grandmother tells him the ancient legend of the valley, a story about how all the creatures once lived in harmony, guided by peaceful tree-like guardian beings called the Dzo. The Dzo grew magical glowing pods that allowed creatures to change their physical forms and understand the languages and perspectives of other species. This was the foundation of unity and peace across the valley. However, everything changed when a ruthless true wolf stole one of those magical pods, a pod that granted the power of fire. That tree wolf transformed into the terrifying and destructive creature known as the firewolf. The firewolf went on a rampage, killing 4 of the Dzo and causing a massive forest fire that triggered a rockslide, which created a large dam blocking the valley's river, flooding parts of the land and preventing the surviving Dzo from ever returning. Since that catastrophe, the different species of the valley have lived separately, in fear and suspicion of one another, never communicating and never trusting creatures outside their own kind. The puka followed one rule above all else: hide today, alive tomorrow. Young Ali has always found it difficult to accept this way of life. One day, during the Puka's annual Piplet Festival, a celebration held in gratitude for their primary food source. A young Javan bird lands on Puka Island. The Javans are large, magnificent green birds resembling a cross between a kakapo and a secretary bird, and they are considered natural enemies of the Puku. Ali, driven by his curiosity rather than his fear, approaches this young Javan chick instead of running away. In that encounter, he shows her how to find food on the island. This seemingly innocent moment has enormous consequences, because the young Javan calls back her flock, and soon an entire group of Javans descends on Puku Island, taking over the food sources that the Puku depend on to survive. Years pass after this incident, and the Puku community is now facing starvation because their food supply has been severely reduced. Ali carries a deep sense of guilt over this, knowing that his curiosity and openness started the chain of events that led to his community's suffering. In an attempt to make things right, he tries to use reflective glass shards to drive the Javans away from the harvest grounds. The plan backfires badly. One of the Javans attacks him, and Ali falls into a deep hole in the ground. As he tries to climb out of the hole, he accidentally lands on one of the ancient magical pods left behind by the long-gone Zo. The pod transforms him instantly into a Javan bird. Ali, now trapped inside the body of a Javan, is completely disoriented. He tries to return home and tell his parents who he is, but they do not recognize him and assume that a Javan bird has attacked or swallowed their son. He is driven off the island and falls into the river. Ali is rescued from the water by a Javan named Ivy, voiced by Juno Temple, who ironically was the same bird who had attacked him earlier. Ivy pulls him out of the water along with her two sisters, Violet, voiced by Ambika Mad, and Lily, voiced by Lolly Aidfope. Ali desperately tries to explain to Ivy that he is actually a Puku trapped inside a Javan's body and that he needs to find another magical pod to reverse the transformation. This is where a key supporting character enters the story. A cheerful, somewhat goofy, purple grouper-like fish named Boogle, voiced by Tracy Morgan, appears and tells them that he knows where another magical pod can be found, resting on a nearby dead Zo. The group sets off toward it, but when they reach it, Ivy accidentally touches the pod and is transformed into a Puku herself, because Puku was the last word she said before making contact. Now both of them are stuck in the wrong bodies, both miserable, and both desperate to change back. Boogle then tells them about yet another pod located near the Great Waterfall, and the unlikely trio sets off on a journey across the valley to find it. This journey forms the heart of the film. As Ali and Ivy travel together through the valley, they encounter all manner of creatures, including tree wolves, root snakes, and rock bears, each presenting a different challenge. Through these encounters, they are forced to rely on each other's abilities and knowledge. Ali teaches Ivy how to use the heightened sense of smell that Pukus possess to detect threats from a distance, and Ivy teaches Ali how to use the strength and agility of a Javan's body. Slowly and reluctantly, they begin to develop an understanding of each other. During their journey, Ali also learns something deeply important about Ivy. He discovers that the reason Ivy brought her flock to Puku Island in the first place was not out of aggression or greed but out of desperation. The Javan's own home at Javan Rock had been running critically low on food, and several members of Ivy's flock, including her parents, had already died of starvation. She had brought her flock to the island simply because it was the only way to keep them alive. This revelation shifts Ali's perspective entirely and complicates his feelings toward Ivy and toward the conflict between their two species. They eventually reach the pod, but at a critical moment, Ali hesitates because he is still not fully sure he can trust Ivy. This moment of doubt leads to a confrontation, and in the chaos, both of them fall onto the pod together and are both transformed into booglefish. Now all three of them are fish, navigating the waters of the valley in yet another unfamiliar form. Boogle tells them he knows where to find even more pods, near the Great Waterfall, and the group presses on. When they finally reach the waterfall and locate the pods, They use them to restore themselves to their original forms. But it is at this moment that the film delivers its biggest twist and its darkest turn. When the trio allows Boogle to use one of the pods to transform into a creature of his choice, Boogle reveals his true identity. He is not the friendly, harmless fish he appeared to be. He is the firewolf himself, the ancient and terrifying creature who divided the valley generations ago. The Zo had transformed him into a fish to contain him and stop his destruction, but now, with the magical pods in hand, he is free again. The firewolf destroys all the remaining pods, ensuring that no one can stop him, and then brutally attacks Ivy, leaving her badly injured and unconscious. Ollie, now faced with the reality of a threat far bigger than anything he imagined when his journey began, carries an injured Ivy back to Javan Rock so she can recover. With Ivy recovering and the firewolf now unleashed and beginning to attack the valley, Ollie returns to his own island to rally his community. He confronts his father, Kulu, voiced by Cedric the Entertainer, and begs him to trust the other creatures of the valley despite all the fear and history that divides them. It is a deeply emotional moment that pushes Kulu and the other Pukas to open their hearts after generations of isolation. As the firewolf advances toward the island, Ollie goes back to the hole where his journey began, the same hole where he first fell and touched the magical pod. Deep inside it, he finds a dead Zo, and through a web of glowing roots, the spirit of that Zo communicates with Ollie, pleading with him to send a pod so that the spirit can act. Ollie makes the ultimate sacrifice. He uses the last remaining pod to transform himself into a Zo, becoming the very creature of legend that the valley so desperately needs. In this transformed state, he faces the firewolf directly. He breaks the dam that has been blocking the valley's rivers since the firewolf's original rampage, releasing the floodwaters and washing the firewolf away, saving the valley at the cost of what everyone believes is his own life. The Pukas and Javans mourn Ollie together, and for the first time in generations, the two communities stand side by side, united in grief. But then the Zo who had been scattered and exiled from the valley for so long begin to return, and they reveal that Ollie is alive. He has been restored to his Puka form by the Zo themselves, who brought him back as a reward for his selflessness and bravery. The valley begins to heal. The Pukas and Javans reconnect, share their knowledge and strengths, and begin building a life together as allies rather than enemies. Ollie's journey, which began as one small creature's curiosity, ends as the bridge between two entire communities, and the valley becomes a place of harmony once more. Cast. The voice cast of Swapped is genuinely impressive and features some of the most recognizable names in the industry today. Michael B. Jordan leads the cast as Ollie, the small, brave, and endlessly curious Puku at the center of the story. Jordan is known for his powerful performances in films like the Creed franchise and Black Panther, and he brings the same warmth and emotional depth to this animated role. Juno Temple, known for her acclaimed work in Ted Lasso and Fargo, voices Ivy, the Javan bird who becomes Ollie's reluctant partner and eventual friend. The director himself has spoken about the extraordinary chemistry between Jordan and Temple, describing their performances as alive, funny one second and deeply moving the next. Tracy Morgan, the beloved comedian and actor from 30 Rock and The Daily Show, voices Boogle, the mysterious purple fish who turns out to be the firewolf in disguise. Cedric the Entertainer voices Kalu, Ollie's cautious and protective father. Justina Machado, well known from Grey's Anatomy and One Day at a Time, voices Callie, Ollie's mother. Ambi Kamad, who gained wide recognition from her role in the British series This Is Going to Hurt, voices Violet, one of Ivy's sisters. Lolly Aidphobe voices Lily, Ivy's other sister. Tata Vega voices Ollie's wise and storytelling grandmother. Camden Brooks voices the younger version of Ollie in flashback sequences. John Ratzenberger, a longtime Pixar favorite, also appears as Elder Javan. The full ensemble gives the film a rich, layered vocal performance that brings its entirely original world of creatures convincingly to life. Release date and trailer info. Swapped was officially released on May 1, 2026, both on Netflix globally and in select theaters in a limited theatrical run. The film's official trailer was released on April 2, 2026, giving audiences their first proper look at the valley, the characters, and the world of the film. The trailer immediately drew comparisons to classic Pixar films in terms of its visual ambition and emotional tone, though the film ultimately charts its own distinct course. The movie is rated PG for action, peril, and some scary images, which is a fair reflection of its content. It is family-friendly but has genuine tension, particularly in its final act involving the firewolf, which may be intense for very young children. Themes and what makes it special. At its core, Swapped is a film about empathy. It uses the classic body swap premise, familiar from films like Freaky Friday and It's a Boy-Girl Thing, but places it in a breathtakingly original animated world and gives it genuine emotional stakes. The central message is that you cannot truly understand another person, or another creature, until you have lived in their circumstances, seen the world through their eyes, and experienced the fears and pressures that shaped their choices. Ollie and Ivy begin the story as enemies and end it as the closest of allies, and their transformation is not just physical. It is deeply personal, built through shared hardship and the slow, difficult process of choosing trust over fear. The film also carries a broader message about community and the danger of division. The Valley's communities have been separated for generations by fear, suspicion, and a history of violence they did not personally create. It takes the courage of one small creature, willing to look beyond what he has been taught to fear, to begin the process of healing that divide. The Firewolf himself is a complex villain in this regard. His destructiveness was born not from pure evil but from pain and rejection, from being cast out by his own pack. The film does not excuse what he has done, but it frames his origins in a way that adds an unexpected layer of sadness to his character. The animation itself has been widely praised for its lush and distinctive visual design. The Valley is a genuinely beautiful world, filled with creatures that exist on a creative spectrum between plant and animal, resulting in character designs that feel completely unlike anything seen in mainstream animation before. The world building is rich and specific, and the film clearly reflects the enormous amount of thought and care that went into developing it over nearly 8 years of production. The complete story of Swapped, 2026. The world of the Valley. Before the story of Ollie and Ivy begins, you need to understand the world they live in, because it is unlike any world you have ever seen in an animated film. The Valley is a breathtaking, lush, and completely magical place. It is not the kind of world we live in. It is a world where the line between animal and plant does not exist in the way we understand it. Every creature in the valley exists somewhere on a spectrum between plant and animal. Some creatures have bark-like fur. Some have leaves growing from their bodies. Some have roots instead of limbs. The valley is teeming with life, color, and beauty. And yet beneath all of that beauty lies a deep and painful history of division, fear, and loss. In the center of the valley runs a great river, and in the middle of that river sits a small island. This island is home to a community of creatures called the Puku. The Puku are small, round, furry creatures that look very much like tiny sea otters. They are warm, close-knit, and deeply protective of one another. They live simple lives on their island, fishing, foraging, and celebrating the natural abundance that their home provides. But they live with one rule that governs everything they do, a rule passed down from generation to generation without question. That rule is this: hide today, alive tomorrow. The Puku do not venture beyond their island. They do not interact with the other creatures of the valley. They stay within their boundaries and they stay safe. On the other side of the valley, rising up from the earth like a great monument, stands a towering structure of rock called Javan Rock. This is the home of the Javans, a species of large, magnificent green birds. The Javans are proud, powerful, and fiercely communal. They look like a striking combination of a kakapo and a secretary bird, large and green and deeply impressive in their physical presence. They rule the skies above the valley and are considered, by almost every other creature, to be one of the most formidable species in the land. Between the Puka and the Javans, there is no friendship, no alliance, and no communication. They are, by every definition of the word, natural enemies. The Puka fear the Javans because the Javans are large, fast, and powerful. The Javans look down on the Puka as small, insignificant creatures hardly worth their attention. These two communities have lived in total separation for as long as anyone alive can remember, and the reason for that separation is a story that the elders of both communities carry with deep sadness. Long ago, the valley was not a place of division. It was a place of harmony. All the creatures of the valley lived together, communicated with one another, and understood each other, and the reason they could do all of this was because of a group of ancient and extraordinary beings called the Tzo. The Tzo were enormous, peaceful, tree-like creatures. They looked somewhat like elephants, but their bodies were covered in bark and branches, and growing from their backs were great living orchards, full of color and life. The Tzo were the guardians and the heart of the valley, and they possessed a unique and extraordinary gift. They grew magical pods. These pods, glowing with a soft and beautiful purple light, had the power to transform any creature that touched them into another species entirely. But more than just physically changing a creature, the pods also gave that creature the ability to speak and understand the language of every other species in the valley. The Tzo shared these pods generously, and through them, the creatures of the valley built bridges of understanding that kept them united for countless generations. But that peace was shattered by a single act of greed and cruelty. One day, a tree wolf, one of the fearsome wolf-like predators of the valley, stole one of the magical pods. This particular pod was unlike the others. It carried within it the power of fire. When the tree wolf touched it, he was not simply transformed into another creature. He was transformed into something ancient, something monstrous, something that had never existed in the valley before. He became the firewolf. The firewolf was enormous, terrifying, and consumed by rage and destructive power. He rampaged through the valley, breathing fire and spreading devastation. In his rampage, he killed 4 of the Tzo, the very beings who had been the valley's guardians and the source of all its unity. The fire he spread caused a catastrophic rockslide, and that rockslide created a massive dam across the valley's river. The dam blocked the flow of water, flooded parts of the land, and cut the valley off from itself. The surviving Tzo, overwhelmed and unable to stop the firewolf, eventually used their power to contain him, transforming the firewolf into a small, harmless fish so that he could no longer cause destruction. But the damage was already done. The Tzo themselves were too weakened to remain in the valley. They left, scattered to the far edges of the world, and they never came back. Without the Tzo, without the magical pods, and without the bridges of understanding that those pods had made possible, the different species of the valley retreated into themselves. They stopped talking. They stopped trusting. They stopped trying to understand one another. Generation after generation passed, and the history of the valley's unity became little more than a legend, a story told by grandmothers to their young ones on quiet evenings, a story that felt more like a dream than a memory. The valley became a place ruled by fear, suspicion, and silence. Ali. This is the world that Ali was born into. Ali is young, small, and full of a curiosity that his community has absolutely no use for. From the time he was a tiny puka pup, Ali found himself drawn to the edges of the island, staring out across the river at the valley beyond. He watched the other creatures from a safe distance. He noticed things. He wondered things. He asked questions that none of the other pukas seemed to want to answer. His parents, Kala and Kali, loved him deeply but were also constantly exhausted by his restless nature. Kalu, Ali's father, was a firm believer in the old ways. He trusted the rule of the island. Hide today, alive tomorrow. That rule had kept the puka safe for generations, and Kalu saw absolutely no reason to question it. Kali, Ali's mother, was gentler in her approach but no less protective. She worried about Ali in the way only a mother can, quietly, constantly, and without pause. Ali's grandmother was a different story. She was old and wise and full of stories, and she was the one who told Ali the full legend of the valley. She told him about the Zo and the magical pods. She told him about the firewolf and the destruction he caused. She told him that the different creatures of the valley had once lived in beautiful harmony, and that the only reason they no longer did so was because of fear and betrayal. Ali listened to these stories with wide eyes and a racing heart. Something in him refused to accept that this was simply the way things had to be. He could not understand why creatures who had once lived together in peace could not find their way back to that peace again. But he was young, and the island was his home, and for a while, he kept his curiosity contained. The day everything changed. The Pukas celebrated the Piplet festival each year with great joy and enthusiasm. Piplets were small, abundant, delicious creatures that served as the Pukas' primary food source, and the festival was the community's way of giving thanks for the abundance of their island. It was a day of music, gathering, and celebration, and for a brief time, even Ali's restless mind was stilled by the warmth and happiness of the occasion. It was on this day that Ali first saw her. A young Javan chick, small and uncertain, landed on the edge of Puka Island. She was separated from her flock and clearly unsure of where she was. Every other Puka froze. Some ran. Some hid. The sight of a Javan on the island, even a young one, was enough to send the community into a quiet panic. But Ali did not run. He stood and he watched her, and then, driven by the same unstoppable curiosity that had always defined him, he walked toward her. He introduced himself. The young Javan, startled but not unfriendly, watched him carefully. Ali showed her the island. He showed her the piplets. He showed her how to find food among the plants and rocks of the shoreline. It was a small, innocent, genuinely kind gesture from a young creature who simply wanted to connect with someone different from himself. The young Javan seemed grateful. She watched him, she listened to him, and then she called out to her flock. What happened next was something Ali never intended and could never have predicted. The call brought not just the young Javan's family but an entire group of Javans to the island. They descended on the Puka's home in large numbers, and they discovered the piplets that Ali had shown the young chick how to find. The Javans, who had their own food pressures back at Javan Rock, immediately recognized the piplets as an extraordinary food source. Within a short time, they had established themselves as a regular presence on the island, helping themselves to the very food supply that the Puka depended on for survival. The Puka community was devastated. Their food stores began to shrink. The emergency reserve started running low. Kalu was furious and heartbroken, and though he never said it directly to Ali's face, everyone in the community knew whose fault this was. Ali carried the weight of that guilt every single day. He had wanted to build a bridge, and instead he had started a crisis. Years passed, and the situation did not improve. The Pukas were running out of food, and their community was growing desperate. Ali, unable to sit still while his people suffered because of something he had set in motion, decided to do something about it. He came up with a plan to use reflective glass shards to frighten the Javans off the harvest grounds, using the reflected light to startle and confuse them so that they would leave the Puka's food sources alone. It was a clever idea, the kind of clever idea that Ali was always coming up with, but it did not go the way he planned. One of the Javans, large and aggressive, spotted Ali and attacked him. In the chaos and confusion, Ali stumbled backward and fell into a deep hole in the ground near the edge of the island, a hole that had always been there but that no Puka had ever paid much attention to. Ali hit the bottom of the hole hard and found himself in the dark, surrounded by earth and roots and silence. As he tried to find his footing and climb back out, he noticed something glowing in the shadows of the hole. A soft, beautiful, pulsing purple light. One of the ancient magical pods, left behind by the Zo long ago, resting at the bottom of this forgotten hole in the earth. Before Ali could think about what he was doing, before he could understand what he was reaching toward, he slipped and landed directly on top of it. The pod activated instantly. The light flooded through him. Ali felt something impossible happening to his body, a pulling and stretching and reshaping that was terrifying and overwhelming. And then it was over. He looked at his hands. They were not paws. They were wings. He looked at his feet. They were talons. He reached up and touched his face and felt the beak where his nose and mouth had been. Ali was no longer a puku. He had been transformed into a Javan. The swap. Ali climbed out of the hole and immediately tried to go home. He stumbled toward the island, desperate for the comfort of his family and his community. But when he reached his parents, they did not see their son. They saw a Javan bird. They saw a predator. They saw the very thing they had spent their lives protecting themselves from. Kalu, acting on pure protective instinct, attacked. Ali tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to tell his father that he was right there, that this was him, that their Ali was inside this strange Javan body. But his voice was different now, the sounds that came out of him were the sounds of a Javan, and his parents could not understand him. He was driven off the island. He fell from the edge and plunged into the river. The current caught him and pulled him downstream, and for a terrifying moment, Ali, trapped in a body he did not know how to use, was completely at the mercy of the water. He was rescued. The Javan who pulled him from the river was the same one who had attacked him in the first place. Her name was Ivy, and she was the older sister of the young chick Ali had met years ago at the festival. Ivy dragged him onto dry land on the valley side of the river, and she stood over him, studying him with sharp, intelligent eyes. Her two younger sisters, Violet and Lily, stood nearby, watching curiously. Ali, gasping and disoriented, tried to explain what had happened. He told Ivy that he was a puku. That his name was Ali. That he had fallen into a hole and touched something that had transformed him into a Javan, and that he desperately needed to find a way to change back. Ivy stared at him. This was the valley, where different species did not talk to each other, where natural enemies kept their distance, and where a small furry creature claiming to be trapped inside a Javan's body was, by any reasonable measure, absolutely impossible. And yet here was this Javan, speaking in a way that no Javan Ivy had ever met spoke, fumbling with its wings like someone who had never had wings before, looking at its own talons with an expression of complete bewilderment and horror. Ivy was skeptical, but she was also paying close attention. Before they could figure out what to do, a tree wolf appeared on the edge of the tree line, drawn by the commotion near the river. Tree wolves were one of the valley's most dangerous predators, fast and relentless, with thick dark fur and teeth designed to do serious damage. Ali, who had no idea how to fly, had no way to escape one. Ivy made a rapid decision. She coated him in dung, smearing the foul-smelling material across his feathers so that the tree wolf would not detect his unfamiliar scent. It was disgusting and humiliating, but it worked. The tree wolf moved on, and Ali survived his first few minutes in the valley. It was shortly after this that Boogle appeared. Boogle was a fish unlike any other in the valley. He was large, round, and purple, with fins made of flowing algae. He had a big expressive face and an even bigger, cheerful personality that seemed completely at odds with the dire situation Ali found himself in. Boogle had been swimming the waters of the valley for a very long time, and he knew every corner of it. He told Ali that he knew where to find another magical pod, growing on a nearby dead Zo whose body had not yet fully decomposed. He offered to lead them to it. Ali agreed immediately. This was the answer he had been looking for. A pod that could change him back. The three of them, Ollie, Ivy, and Boogle, set off toward the location of the pod. When they arrived, Ollie moved toward it carefully. But Ivy, trying to help or perhaps simply getting too close in her curiosity, reached out and touched it at the moment Ollie was nearest to it. The word on Ivy's lips at that instant was Puku. She had been talking about pukus when she touched the pod, and the pod, guided by intention and language, transformed her into one. Just like that, Ivy was no longer a large, powerful green bird. She was a small, round, furry puku, staring at her own stubby paws with an expression of absolute disbelief and fury. Now both of them were trapped. Ollie was a Javan who did not know how to fly. Ivy was a puku who had never had to survive without her wings. They were stuck with each other, in each other's species, and neither of them was happy about it. The journey across the valley. Boogle, endlessly helpful and cheerful, informed them that he knew of another pod located near the great waterfall, deep in the valley. It was further away and the journey would be difficult, but it was their best option. Ollie and Ivy had absolutely no choice but to agree. They were going to have to travel across a valley full of predators and dangers, in bodies that were completely unfamiliar to them, side by side, whether they liked each other or not. They did not like each other. Not at first. Ivy found Ollie's relentless curiosity and optimism exhausting and naive. She had lived in the valley as a Javan her whole life. She knew how dangerous it was, how little room there was for sentimentality or idealism. She was practical, guarded, and deeply private. Ollie, on the other hand, found Ivy's coldness and dismissiveness frustrating. He was trying to connect with her, trying to understand her, and she kept shutting him down. But the valley had a way of forcing connection whether you wanted it or not. As they journeyed through the different regions of the valley, they encountered creature after creature, predator after predator, challenge after challenge. And with each challenge, they had to rely on each other. Ollie, now in Ivy's Javan body, had the physical power of a large bird but no idea how to use it. Ivy, in Ollie's puku body, had the strong sense of smell and the agility of the puku but none of the instincts to go with it. They spent a great deal of their journey teaching each other how to use their borrowed bodies, and through that teaching, something began to shift between them. Ollie taught Ivy how to use the puku's extraordinary sense of smell to detect threats before they could be seen. He explained that pukus could smell predators from a significant distance, and that this sense was the primary reason the puku had survived as long as they had despite being one of the valley's smaller and more vulnerable species. Ivy, in turn, taught Ollie how to move with the confidence and precision of a Javan, how to use the power in those great wings and the sharpness of those talons. She taught him how to read the air and the environment in the way a bird naturally does. As they traveled, they also began to talk to each other in a more honest way. And it was during one of these conversations that Ollie learned something about Ivy that completely changed how he saw her. He had always assumed, along with every other puku, that the Javans had come to their island out of greed and aggression. He had believed that the invasion of Puku Island was a power move, an act of territorial dominance. But Ivy told him the truth. The Javans had come to Puku Island because they were starving. The food sources at Javan Rock had been diminishing for a long time. Several members of Ivy's flock had already died, including her parents. Ivy had brought her family to the Puku's island not because she wanted to take something from them but because she was trying to keep the people she loved alive. She had been carrying that grief and that desperation alone, and the coldness that Ollie had found so off-putting was not cruelty. It was exhaustion. It was the weight of someone who had been holding everything together for too long. Ollie was quiet for a long time after hearing this. The guilt he had carried about introducing the Javans to the island shifted into something more complicated. He had blamed himself, but now he understood that the situation was not as simple as guilt and fault. Everyone in the valley was simply trying to survive, and the valley's structure of fear and division was making that survival harder for everyone. They pushed on through the valley, navigating its different ecosystems and the creatures that inhabited them. They were ambushed by tree wolves at one point, a terrifying and breathless chase through dense trees that tested everything they had learned from each other. They faced root snakes, enormous serpents that moved through the ground itself, erupting from the earth to strike at anything that moved. They crossed territories ruled by rock bears, massive and territorial creatures that had to be navigated with extreme care. Through all of it, Ollie and Ivy moved together, covered each other, and slowly, without either of them quite deciding to, they became a team. They reached the pod Boogle had told them about, and for a moment, everything seemed like it was about to be resolved. The pod was right there. Ollie reached for it. And then he stopped. Despite everything they had been through, despite all the trust that had built up between them over the course of their journey, a small, stubborn part of Ollie hesitated. He looked at Ivy and he felt the old fear again, the instinct that the puka had carried for generations. She was a Javan. Their species were enemies. Could he really be sure that the moment they were back in their own bodies, she would not simply return to her old ways? That moment of hesitation was enough. A confrontation broke out between them, and in the chaos and confusion, both of them fell onto the pod at the same time. The pod activated. But because either of them had said a species name clearly at the moment of contact, both of them were transformed into fish. Not Javans. Not pukas. Fish. Specifically, they were transformed into the same species as Boogle. Now all three of them were fish, floating in the valley's waters, and the situation had become considerably more complicated. The truth about Boogle. Boogle, still cheerful and apparently unfazed by the fact that his two traveling companions had accidentally become fish, told them not to worry. He knew exactly where more pods were. Near the great waterfall. He had always known, he said, because he had been swimming the valley's waters for a very long time. He led them to the waterfall, and sure enough, there were more pods, glowing softly in the mist and the water. They reached them. They touched them. Ollie became a puku again. Ivy became a Javan again. The relief was enormous. And then they made a mistake. Not a malicious mistake. A kind one. Boogle had helped them throughout this entire journey. He had guided them, encouraged them, and kept their spirits up during the darkest stretches. He was alone in the valley, the only one of his kind, and he had told them that he wanted to use one of the pods to transform into a different creature so that he would no longer be so isolated. It seemed like the least they could do, after everything he had done for them, to allow him to choose a form. Boogle touched the pod. And everything changed. The friendly, goofy, harmless purple fish was gone. What stood before Ollie and Ivy now was something enormous and terrifying. The firewolf. Ancient, massive, wrapped in shadow and flame, its eyes burning with a cold and furious light. Boogle had not been a simple fish at all. He was the firewolf himself, the creature that had destroyed the valley's peace generations ago. The creature that the Zo had transformed into a fish in order to contain him. He had been swimming those waters for longer than anyone alive could remember, biding his time, waiting for the moment when creatures desperate enough would give him what he needed to be free. And Ollie and Ivy, in their gratitude and their trust, had given him exactly that. The firewolf destroyed all the remaining pods in an instant, smashing them so that no one could use them against him. And then he turned his rage on Ivy, striking her with brutal force, sending her crashing to the ground, where she lay still and unconscious. Ollie, smaller than the firewolf by an almost incomprehensible measure, could do nothing but get Ivy out of there. He gathered her up and carried her, struggling under the weight, back toward Javan Rock, the place she called home, the place where she could recover. The final battle. With Ivy recovering at Javan Rock and the firewolf now unleashed and beginning to tear through the valley with devastating force, Ali faced a reality that was bigger than anything he had prepared for when he set out on this journey. This was not just about getting back to his own body anymore. This was not just about Ali and Ivy's personal conflict, or their community's food crisis. The entire valley was in danger. Every creature in it, puku, javan, tree wolf, root snake, rock bear, every living thing that made its home in that magical world, was at risk. Ali went back to his island. He walked through the community of pukus who were terrified and exhausted and had no idea what was coming for them. He found his father, Kalu, and he stood before him, and he said what needed to be said. He told Kalu that the only way they were going to survive this was if they stopped being afraid of the creatures around them. He told him that they had to open the island to the Javans, to work together with species they had feared their entire lives. He told him that the division in the valley was not protecting anyone anymore. It was going to get everyone killed. Kalu was not a man, or a puku, who changed easily. He had spent his entire life believing in the rule, hide today, alive tomorrow. He had watched his community struggle and suffer under the old order, and some part of him had always believed that the safest thing was to keep their heads down and stay within their boundaries. But he looked at his son, his curious, relentless, impossible son who had somehow walked across the entire valley, made an alliance with a Javan, and come back alive, and something in him gave way. Kalu agreed. The island opened. The Pukas and the Javans, two species who had spent generations regarding each other as enemies, gathered together on the island's shores, terrified and uncertain but together. It was fragile and imperfect and full of tension, but it was real. As the firewolf advanced toward the island, Ali knew that simply gathering together was not going to be enough. The firewolf was ancient and enormous and burning with power that no ordinary creature could match. There was no conventional way to fight him. But then Ali remembered the hole. The hole at the edge of the island where this whole story had begun. The hole where he had first touched the magical pod and been transformed into a Javan. He ran back to it, and climbed down into it, and in the dark at the bottom, he found what he had hoped might be there but had not known for certain. A dead Zo. One of the ancient guardians, its body long still, but its roots still glowing faintly with a dying light. And through those roots, through that web of ancient power that connected all the Zo to one another and to the valley itself, a spirit reached out to Ali. The spirit of the Zo pleaded with him. It asked for one last pod. It asked for one final chance to protect the valley it had once called home. Ali found the pod. He held it. He knew what it would cost him. He knew that if he touched this pod and transformed, he might not come back. He might not be Ali the Puka anymore. He might not go home to his mother, and his father, and his grandmother. He might not see Ivy again, the friend he had earned in the most difficult way imaginable. He knew all of this, and he touched the pod anyway. The transformation was unlike anything that had happened to him before. He did not become a Javan or a fish. He became something vast and ancient and extraordinary. He became a Zo. One of the great tree-like guardians, towering and powerful, filled with the ancient magic that had once held the valley together. And in that form, he faced the firewolf. The battle was enormous. Ali, now a Zo, fought the firewolf with everything that form contained, and in the end, he did the one thing that could actually stop the firewolf's rampage. He broke the dam. The great rockslide dam that the firewolf's original rampage had created generations ago, the dam that had blocked the valley's river and flooded the land and cut the communities off from one another. Ali broke it open. The river surged through, free at last, the water rushing with tremendous force through the valley. The flood swept the firewolf away, carrying him downstream, his ancient rage extinguished at last by the force of the river that he himself had once blocked. The valley was silent. The firewolf was gone. But so was Ali. The ending. The Pukas and Javans stood together on the island and they grieved. They grieved for Ali, the small, curious, impossible puku who had somehow managed to change everything. Ivy stood among them, and her grief was as real and as deep as any puku's, because Ollie had not just been an unlikely ally to her. He had been a friend. He had been the first creature outside her own species who had ever truly seen her, not as a Javan or a predator or an enemy, but as herself. And then, from the edges of the valley, from the directions that no one had expected, they came. The Zo. The ancient guardians who had been scattered and exiled for generations, driven from their home by the firewolf's destruction. They came back to the valley, walking slowly and majestically from the far reaches of the world, their great orchard-topped bodies filling the air with the scent of life and growth. And they brought something with them. They brought Ollie. He was a puku again. Small and round and furry, exactly as he had always been, exactly as he had always needed to be. The Zo had restored him. His sacrifice had not been the end of him after all. The valley had a way of returning what was given to it with love. Kalu crossed the space between pukus and ran to his son. Callie was right beside him. Ollie's grandmother watched from nearby, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone whose oldest and deepest hope had finally been answered. Ivy found Ollie in the crowd, and the look they exchanged said everything that neither of them had the words for, the recognition of two creatures who had been through something that no one else could fully understand, who had earned each other's trust in the hardest possible way, and who would carry that friendship for the rest of their lives. The valley began to heal. With the dam broken, the river ran free again for the first time in generations, and as the water returned to its natural course, the land on either side of it began to breathe again. The pukas stayed on their island, but it was no longer a fortress of isolation. It became a crossroads. Pukus and Javans moved between the island and Javan rock, sharing knowledge, sharing food, sharing the strengths of each species so that neither community would face what they had faced alone. The different creatures of the valley began to look at one another with something new in their eyes. Not without wariness, not without the memory of all those generations of division, but with a willingness to try. With a recognition that the valley was large enough for all of them if they were willing to share it. Ollie's grandmother's story, the story that had always seemed like legend and myth, had turned out to be true. The valley had once been a place of harmony, and now, through the courage of one small puku who simply refused to accept that fear was the only way to live, it was finding its way back to that harmony again. The creatures of the valley had been swapped, in more ways than one. Ollie and Ivy had swapped bodies, yes. But something deeper had been swapped too. The fear that had filled the valley for generations had been swapped, little by little, for something that felt a great deal like hope. Michael B. Jordan. Michael Bakery Jordan was born on February 9, 1987, in Santa Ana, California, but he did not grow up in California. His family relocated to Newark, New Jersey when he was very young, and Newark became the city that truly shaped who he was as a person and eventually as an artist. He grew up in a working-class household in a neighborhood that was rough around the edges, the kind of place where a young person either gets swallowed up by the environment or finds something to hold on to. Michael found acting, and he held on to it with everything he had. His mother, Donna Jordan, worked at a Newark arts organization, and his father, Michael A. Jordan, worked in several different capacities over the years to keep the family stable. Michael has two siblings, a sister named Jamila and a brother named Khalid. From a very young age, Michael showed an intensity and a focus that set him apart from other kids his age. He was athletic, driven, and deeply observant of the world around him. He began his career as a child model, appearing in advertisements for companies including Toys R Us and Modell's Sporting Goods. These early experiences in front of cameras gave him a comfort with the professional side of the entertainment industry that most child actors take years to develop. He transitioned into acting naturally, landing small television roles while still a teenager. His very first notable television appearance came on the soap opera The Cosby Show's spin-off, and he later appeared in several other television productions in minor roles that nonetheless gave him invaluable on-set experience. The role that truly introduced Michael B. Jordan to a serious audience came when he was cast as Wallace in the HBO drama series The Wire. The Wire, which debuted in 2002, is widely considered one of the greatest television dramas ever made, and Jordan's portrayal of Wallace, a young teenager caught up in Baltimore's drug trade, was heartbreaking in its authenticity and emotional depth. He was only a teenager himself when he played the role, and the rawness he brought to it was not performance. It was real. He understood Wallace's world in a way that came from growing up close enough to that kind of environment to feel it in his bones. After The Wire, Jordan continued working steadily in television. He had a recurring role on the medical drama ER, playing a troubled teenage character across multiple episodes, and he appeared in several other television projects that kept him busy and working while he continued developing his craft. But it was a role on a small but beloved NBC drama called Parenthood that gave him his next significant showcase. He played a young man named Alex for a period of the show's run, and his warm, grounded performance earned him significant attention from the industry. The breakthrough that changed everything came in 2012 when Jordan was cast in Fruitvale Station, directed by Ryan Coogler. Fruitvale Station was a film based on the true story of Oscar Grant, a young black man who was killed by a police officer at a BART station in Oakland, California on New Year's Day 2009. The film was intimate, devastating, and deeply humanizing. Jordan played Oscar Grant with such quiet dignity and such palpable life that audiences left theaters feeling as though they had lost someone they personally knew. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and won both the Grand Jury Prize and the Audience Award in the dramatic competition, and it announced Jordan not just as a promising young actor but as a genuinely extraordinary one. What made Fruitvale Station remarkable beyond Jordan's performance was the relationship it established with Ryan Coogler. The two men, both young, both black, both from the Bay Area, formed a creative partnership built on deep mutual trust and a shared understanding of the world they were depicting. That partnership would define both of their careers for the next decade and beyond. Their second collaboration was Creed, released in 2015. Creed was a continuation of the Rocky franchise, but it was far more than a sequel. It was a reimagining of the entire mythology, centered on Adonis Creed, the illegitimate son of Apollo Creed, Rocky's legendary opponent and eventual best friend. Jordan played Adonis with fire and vulnerability in equal measure, a young man driven by a need to prove himself that was inseparable from his need to understand who he was and where he came from. The film was a massive critical and commercial success, and Jordan's physical transformation for the role was extraordinary. He trained for months under serious boxing coaches, developing a physique and a technical skill set that made the fight sequences feel genuinely real in a way that most boxing films never quite achieve. He received widespread critical acclaim for the performance and the film, and the franchise at launch became one of the most beloved sports film series of its generation. Coogler and Jordan worked together a third time on Black Panther in 2018, though this time Jordan was not the hero of the story. He played Eric Killmonger, the villain, and he delivered one of the most celebrated villain performances in the history of Marvel films. Killmonger was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was a man shaped by genuine historical injustice, a man whose anger was rooted in legitimate pain, and Jordan made him entirely sympathetic even as he made him terrifying. The final scene between Killmonger and T'Challa is one of the most emotionally complex moments in any superhero film, and it was Jordan who carried the emotional weight of it with breathtaking skill. The performance earned him enormous critical praise and cemented his status as one of the most versatile and powerful actors working in Hollywood. In 2021, Jordan made his directorial debut with Creed 3, released in 2023. Stepping behind the camera for the first time on a major studio film, while also starring in and producing it, was a significant undertaking, and Jordan handled it with the same focused intensity that had characterized his entire career. Creed 3 explored Adonis Creed's past and his relationship with a childhood friend who had spent years in prison, played by Jonathan Majors, and the film received strong reviews, with particular praise directed at Jordan's assured and emotionally intelligent direction. Beyond acting and directing, Jordan has been a prominent voice on social issues, particularly on issues of racial justice and representation in Hollywood. In 2020, he announced through his production company, Outlier Society, that he was implementing an inclusion rider standard for all projects he produces, meaning that diversity and inclusion requirements would be built into every contract for every production under his banner. He has spoken publicly and consistently about the need for more diverse storytelling and for more opportunities for Black filmmakers, writers, and actors across the industry. In his personal life, Michael B. Jordan has been notably private about his relationships over the years, though his romantic life has attracted significant public interest. He is known for his close relationship with his family, particularly his parents, who have remained involved in his life and career throughout his rise to stardom. He is based primarily in Los Angeles and is known among industry colleagues for his professionalism, his work ethic, and his genuine warmth and generosity as a collaborator. Juno Temple. Juno Violet Temple was born on July 21, 1989, in London, England, into a family that was already deeply embedded in the world of film. Her father is Julian Temple, a highly regarded British film director known for his documentary work and his music videos, particularly his long association with the punk movement and bands like the Sex Pistols and the Rolling Stones. Her mother, Amanda Peary, worked as a film producer. Growing up in a household where filmmaking was not just a career but a way of seeing the world gave Juno an extraordinary foundation. She grew up surrounded by creative conversation, by the language of cinema, by an understanding of storytelling that most aspiring actors spend years trying to acquire. She spent parts of her childhood in both England and the United States, as her father's work took the family between the two countries. She attended Bedales School in Hampshire, England, a progressive independent school known for its arts-focused curriculum and its emphasis on creativity and individual expression. Bedales has produced a remarkable number of artists, musicians, and actors over the years, and the environment clearly suited Juno's natural tendencies. She was drawn to performance from a young age, and the school gave her the space to explore that interest seriously. She made her film debut while still a teenager, appearing in the 2008 British film Atonement, directed by Joe Wright and starring Keira Knightley and James McAvoy. It was a small role, but Atonement was a major film, a serious, beautifully crafted adaptation of Ian McEwan's celebrated novel, and appearing in it at such a young age gave Juno immediate credibility and exposure within the film industry. It was a remarkable first step. From there, her career developed quickly. She appeared in a series of British and American productions across the late 2000s and early 2010s, building a reputation as a performer who consistently brought unexpected depth and intelligence to whatever she was given. She had a notable role in the British drama Cracks in 2009, and she appeared in the American comedy Greenberg in 2010, directed by Noah Baumbach and starring Ben Stiller. She also appeared in Kaboom in 2010, directed by Greg Araki, a stylish and strange film that showcased her willingness to take creative risks in challenging material. One of the roles that significantly raised her profile internationally was in The Dark Knight Rises in 2012, Christopher Nolan's conclusion to his Batman trilogy. She played a small but memorable character connected to the villain's plot, and appearing in one of the most anticipated films of the decade, alongside a cast that included Christian Bale, Tom Hardy, Anne Hathaway, and Gary Oldman, brought her to an enormous global audience for the first time. She continued to accumulate an impressive and eclectic filmography throughout the 2010s, appearing in films across wildly different genres. She was in Killer Joe in 2011, a deeply dark and disturbing thriller directed by William Friedkin, in which she gave a performance of remarkable bravery and rawness. She appeared in The Three Musketeers in 2011, offering a lighter and more playful side. She was in Sin City, A Dame to Kill For in 2014, Maleficent in 2014 opposite Angelina Jolie, and in Afternoon Delight in 2013, for which she received significant praise. The role that transformed her from a well-regarded supporting player into a genuine star of the highest order was her performance as Keely Jones in the Apple TV series Ted Lasso, which premiered in 2020. Ted Lasso became one of the most beloved television series of the early 2020s, a warm, funny, and deeply humanistic comedy about an American football coach hired to manage a British soccer team despite knowing nothing about the sport. The show became a cultural phenomenon, praised for its exceptional writing, its ensemble cast, and its radical commitment to kindness and emotional openness in an entertainment landscape that often celebrated cynicism instead. Juno played Keely Jones, a model and influencer who becomes a central part of the AFC Richmond community, and eventually takes charge of the club's public relations. What could have been a relatively superficial character in less capable hands became, under Juno's performance, one of the most fully realized and beloved characters on the show. Keely was funny and generous and deeply loyal, but she was also navigating real questions about identity, ambition, and self-worth, and Juno gave all of that complexity the room it needed. She won a Screen Actors Guild Award as part of the ensemble cast, and her individual performance was consistently singled out by critics as one of the show's greatest assets. Outside of her professional life, Juno Temple is known for being warm, grounded, and refreshingly candid in interviews. She has spoken openly about the challenges of growing up in a family with a famous parent, and the pressure of trying to establish her own identity within an industry that already knew her name before she had done anything to earn that recognition. She has always been clear that she wanted her work to speak for itself, and over 2 decades of consistently excellent performances, it has done exactly that. Tracy Morgan. Tracy Jamal Morgan was born on November 10, 1968, in the Bronx, New York City, and then grew up primarily in Brooklyn, specifically in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood, one of Brooklyn's most historically significant and culturally rich communities. Tracy's childhood was shaped by hardship from its earliest days. His father, Jimmy Morgan, was a Vietnam War veteran who struggled deeply with the psychological and physical consequences of his service. The elder Morgan was a musician who had some talent but whose life was largely derailed by the difficulties he faced after returning from war. He was largely absent from Tracy's life as a child, and his absence left a wound that Tracy has spoken about publicly many times over the years. Tracy grew up poor in one of New York City's tougher neighborhoods during one of New York's most difficult periods, the late 1970s and 1980s, when the city was dealing with economic collapse, rising crime, and the beginning of the crack epidemic. He has spoken frankly about watching people around him be consumed by drugs and violence and poverty, about the daily reality of a neighborhood where options felt limited and the path out was genuinely unclear. He lost his father to AIDS in 1987, when Tracy was just 18 years old, and that loss was devastating and defining in equal measure. From a young age, Tracy discovered that he had a gift for making people laugh. In a life that contained a lot of genuine pain, humor was the thing that kept him connected to the people around him and to himself. He was funny in a way that went beyond just telling jokes. He had a natural and irresistible energy, an ability to find the absurd within the ordinary, and a physical expressiveness that made even the simplest observation into something theatrical and hilarious. He began performing stand-up comedy on the streets of New York while he was still a teenager, passing a hat for money, developing his voice and his material in the most demanding training ground imaginable, a live audience with no patience for anything less than genuine funny. He worked his way through the New York comedy circuit during the late 1980s and early 1990s, performing at clubs and venues across the city, slowly building a reputation as one of the most electric and unpredictable stand-up comedians working in the city. It was his stand-up work that eventually brought him to the attention of the producers of Saturday Night Live, and in 1996, he was hired as a cast member on the show. He remained on SNL for 7 seasons, becoming one of the show's most distinctive and beloved performers during that era. His characters were enormous and committed and wildly funny, rooted in the specificity of his own experience and his community but universal in their absurdity and energy. He left SNL in 2003, and his post-SNL career accelerated dramatically when he was cast as Tracy Jordan in the NBC comedy 30 Rock, which premiered in 2006. Created by and starring Tina Fey, 30 Rock was one of the smartest and most layered comedies on American television during its 7-season run, and Tracy's character, a wildly unpredictable, deeply self-absorbed, and utterly hilarious fictional version of himself, became the beating comedic heart of the show. Playing a version of himself while simultaneously satirizing himself required a genuine intelligence that not every comedian could have pulled off, and Tracy did it with effortless brilliance. The show earned him Emmy nominations and immense critical praise. In June 2014, Tracy Morgan's life was nearly taken from him. He was a passenger in a limousine van on the New Jersey Turnpike when a Walmart truck driver who had been awake for over 24 hours struck the vehicle. The crash was catastrophic. Tracy suffered a traumatic brain injury, a broken nose, broken ribs, and a broken leg. His close friend and fellow comedian James McNair was killed in the accident. Tracy spent weeks in a rehabilitation facility recovering from his injuries, and the road back was long, painful, and deeply uncertain. There were extended periods when the people around him were genuinely unsure whether the Tracy Morgan who had existed before the accident would come back. He did come back. The recovery took the better part of 2 years, and when Tracy returned to public life and to performing, he was visibly changed in some ways but also recognizably himself in the ways that mattered most. His comedy, his warmth, and his enormous personality had survived. He settled the lawsuit with Walmart, and used the outcome to ensure his family's security. He has spoken with remarkable openness about the experience, about the fear and the pain and the slow process of rebuilding himself, and about the profound gratitude he carries for having survived. Cedric the Entertainer. Cedric Antonio Kiles was born on April 24, 1964, in Jefferson City, Missouri, and grew up in the nearby city of Caruthersville, a small town in the southeastern corner of the state. He was raised in a family that was deeply grounded in the African American church community of the rural South, and that upbringing gave him a musical ear, a storytelling sensibility, and an understanding of how to read and hold an audience that would serve him throughout his entire professional life. His family called him Cedric, but the rest of the world would come to know him by the name he earned on stage. Growing up in a small Missouri town in the 1960s and 1970s, Cedric experienced both the warmth of a close-knit community and the very real limitations of life in a segregated and economically constrained environment. He was sharp and funny and observant from a very young age, the kind of kid who could walk into any room and within minutes understand exactly what was going on and find the humor in it. He was a natural performer and a natural communicator, and those qualities drew people to him throughout his childhood and adolescence. He attended Southeast Missouri State University, where he studied mass communications, and it was during his college years that he began performing stand-up comedy more seriously. He was working as an insurance company claims adjuster after college, a steady and respectable job that had absolutely nothing to do with making people laugh, when he finally made the decision to pursue comedy full-time. It was a significant risk for someone with real financial responsibilities and no guarantee of success, but Cedric's confidence in his own abilities was matched by a genuine willingness to put in the work required. He honed his craft on the stand-up circuit throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, developing a style that was deeply rooted in character observation, in the specific textures of Black American life in the South and Midwest, and in a kind of grand theatrical storytelling that borrowed as much from the church sermon as from traditional stand-up comedy. He could hold an audience for extended stretches with a single story, layering detail upon detail, building characters with precision and warmth, and then landing a punchline that hit with the force of everything he had been building toward. He was not just funny. He was a storyteller of genuine skill. His national profile rose dramatically when he became one of the 4 hosts of the original Kings of Comedy, a hugely successful stand-up comedy concert film directed by Spike Lee and released in 2000. The film featured Cedric alongside Steve Harvey, D.L. Hughley, and Bernie Mac, 4 comedians at the peak of their powers performing for enormous, ecstatic live audiences. The original Kings of Comedy became one of the highest-grossing concert films in history and introduced each of its 4 stars to a massive national audience that extended far beyond the comedy world. Cedric's set in the film is a masterclass in stand-up performance, and it remains one of the most celebrated performances of his career. He parlayed that success into a television career that included a starring role on The Steve Harvey Show, a long-running and popular sitcom on which he played Cedric Jackie Robinson, a character whose name alone gives you a sense of the show's affectionate humor. He went on to star in his own series and appeared in numerous successful films, including Barbershop and its sequels, Johnson Family Vacation, and Big Mama's House, among many others. He took over as host of the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire for several seasons and eventually became the host of The Neighborhood, a popular CBS sitcom in which he played Calvin Butler, a proud and opinionated Southern man whose new neighbor forces him to expand his understanding of community and friendship. The Neighborhood has been a significant and enduring hit, running for multiple seasons and consistently earning strong ratings. Throughout all of it, Cedric the Entertainer has remained one of the most recognizable and beloved figures in American comedy, a performer whose roots in church and community and the specific rhythms of Black Southern life have given his work a warmth and specificity that continues to resonate with audiences across generations. Justina Machado. Justina Machado was born on September 6, 1973, in Chicago, Illinois, and grew up in a Puerto Rican family in one of Chicago's vibrant Latino neighborhoods. Growing up as a Puerto Rican girl in Chicago in the 1970s and 1980s meant growing up in a community that was rich in culture and warmth but also navigating a broader American society that did not always see or represent people like her. That experience of being part of a community that was underrepresented and often misrepresented in the mainstream culture she consumed became a defining influence on the kind of roles she sought out and the stories she was drawn to tell throughout her career. She discovered her love of performance early and pursued acting with real determination, studying the craft and working her way through the grinding early stages of a performance career with the kind of patience and persistence that the industry demands. Her early career involved a series of guest appearances on television shows and small roles in film, the standard path of a working actor building their resume and their experience one role at a time. Her breakthrough came when she was cast in the HBO drama 6 Feet Under, which ran from 2001 to 2005 and is still considered one of the finest dramatic series in American television history. The show, created by Alan Ball, followed the Fisher family, who owned and operated a funeral home in Los Angeles, and it used the constant presence of death as a lens through which to examine every aspect of human life, from grief and love to ambition and sexuality. Justina played Vanessa Diaz, the wife of Federico, one of the Fisher family's employees, and she appeared throughout the show's 5-season run. It was a complex and multi-dimensional role in a critically acclaimed show, and her work on it demonstrated clearly that she was a dramatic actress of genuine depth and range. She worked consistently throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s, appearing in a wide range of television productions and building a reputation as one of the most dependable and talented Latina actresses working in Hollywood. She had roles on ER, Queen of the South, and numerous other series. She appeared in the film adaptation of In the Heights in 2021, the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical that celebrated Latino culture and community in New York City. Her role in that film was warm and funny and fully inhabited, as all her performances tend to be. The role that brought her to the widest possible audience was her starring role in the Netflix remake of One Day at a Time, which ran from 2017 to 2020 on Netflix, and then moved to Pop TV for an additional season. The show was a reimagining of the classic Norman Lear sitcom, updated to center on a Cuban-American family in Los Angeles. Justina played Penelope Alvarez, a military veteran and single mother raising 2 children with the help of her traditional Cuban mother, played by the legendary Rita Moreno. The show was exceptional, balancing genuine humor with sincere and unflinching explorations of issues including mental health, immigration, sexuality, and cultural identity. Justina's performance as Penelope was the anchor of everything, a portrait of a woman who was strong and funny and deeply flawed and utterly real, and her work on the show earned her ALMA award recognition and immense critical praise. Ambika Maude. Ambika Maude was born on May 8, 1996, in Hertfordshire, England, to a family with Indian heritage. She grew up in England and pursued her education with genuine seriousness, studying at Cambridge University, one of the world's most prestigious academic institutions, before turning her full attention to acting. The combination of a rigorous academic background and a deep artistic sensibility has given her work a particular quality of intelligence and precision that sets her apart from many of her peers. She began her professional acting career in the early 2020s and rose to significant international attention with remarkable speed. Her breakthrough role came in the critically acclaimed Channel 4 and AMC series This Is Going to Hurt, which aired in 2022. Based on Adam Kay's best-selling memoir about his experiences working as a junior doctor in the National Health Service, the show was one of the most praised British television productions of its year, devastating and darkly funny in equal measure. Ambika played Shruti Acharya, a junior doctor navigating the overwhelming pressures and heartbreaking realities of the NHS, and her performance was immediately recognized as extraordinary, earning her a BAFTA Television Award for Best Supporting Actress. She became only the second South Asian woman to win in that category, and her acceptance speech and public presence during the award season made her one of the most talked about new talents in British entertainment. She followed that breakthrough with the lead role in the Netflix romantic comedy series One Day, released in 2024, based on David Nichols's beloved novel. She played Emma Morley, a young woman whose life is followed across 2 decades through the lens of a single recurring day each year, and her performance was tender, funny, and deeply felt. The series was very well received and further cemented her status as one of the most exciting actresses working in British television and film. Lolly Adefope. Lolly Adefope was born on January 4, 1990, in London, England, to Nigerian parents, and grew up in London before studying at Oxford University, where she read philosophy, politics, and economics, one of the most academically demanding courses at one of the world's most competitive universities. The fact that she went from Oxford to a successful career in comedy and acting is a testament both to the breadth of her talents and to a genuine creative courage that refused to be contained by conventional expectations. She began performing comedy while at Oxford, participating in the university's thriving comedy scene, and after graduating she pursued stand-up comedy and acting with serious intent. She developed a following for her stand-up work and her character comedy, which demonstrated a gift for creating fully realized, specific, and deeply funny characters drawn from the world around her. Her sharp observational intelligence, honed by years of academic training and her own natural curiosity, gave her comedy a particular texture that stood out. She became widely known to international audiences through her role in the Hulu comedy series Shrill, which starred Aidy Bryant and ran from 2019 to 2021. She played Fran, Annie's best friend, a warm and funny and deeply loyal character whose friendship with the show's protagonist was one of its emotional anchors. Her performance in Shrill was widely praised and introduced her to a significant American audience for the first time. She has also appeared in the BBC Three comedy Ghosts, contributing her considerable comedic talent to one of British television's most beloved ensemble casts in recent years. The cultural and historical dimensions of Swapped, 2026. To truly understand what Swapped is doing as a film, you have to look beyond its animated surface and recognize the layers of cultural meaning, historical reflection, and social commentary that are woven into every aspect of its storytelling. On the outside, it presents itself as a colorful, family-friendly adventure about two creatures who swap bodies and go on a journey together. But underneath that surface, it is a film that is in deep and serious conversation with some of the most significant cultural and historical questions of our time. It is a film about division, about the legacy of historical trauma, about how communities come to fear one another, and about what it actually takes to dismantle that fear. It uses the language of fantasy and animation to talk about things that are very real, and it does so with a sincerity and a seriousness of purpose that sets it apart from most animated productions. The world of the valley, the setting of the film, is not a random creation. It is a carefully constructed metaphor for any society that has been fractured by a historical event so devastating that it reshapes the entire way the people within that society understand themselves and each other. The backstory of the valley, the age of harmony under the Zhou, the catastrophic violence of the firewolf, and the resulting generations of division and fear, follows a pattern that is deeply familiar to anyone who has studied the history of human societies around the world. Every culture on Earth has some version of this story. There is a time of relative peace and cooperation. There is an act of violence or betrayal that shatters that peace. There is a long aftermath during which the communities involved retreat into themselves, define themselves in opposition to the other, and pass their fear and suspicion down through generations who had no direct experience of the original trauma but who carry its weight nonetheless. This pattern appears in the histories of colonialism, of ethnic and racial conflict, of religious division, of class warfare, and of countless other forms of social fracture that have defined human civilization across centuries and across continents. Swapped is not set in any one of these specific historical contexts, but it draws on all of them simultaneously. By setting its story in a fantastical world of animal-plant hybrid creatures, it creates enough distance from any single real-world conflict that audiences can engage with the underlying dynamics without the defensiveness that often comes with direct historical reference. This is one of the oldest and most powerful functions of fantasy storytelling, and Swapped uses it deliberately and skillfully. The Zhou, the ancient guardians of the valley, carry significant cultural resonance when viewed through a number of different lenses. In many indigenous cultures around the world, there is a tradition of ancestral wisdom figures, beings or spirits whose presence held communities together, and whose absence marks the beginning of a period of suffering and disorientation. The Zhou function in exactly this way within the mythology of the valley. They are not gods exactly, but they are something more than ordinary creatures. They are the keepers of connection, the ones who made understanding possible, and their departure from the valley left behind a world that slowly forgot what it had once been capable of. The magical pods they grew, which allowed creatures to change form and communicate across species boundaries, are a beautifully conceived symbol of empathy itself, the capacity to inhabit another perspective, to feel what another being feels, to understand a life that is not your own. When the firewolf destroyed the Zhou and their pods were lost, the valley lost its ability to practice empathy at a structural level, and the consequences of that loss accumulated across generations into the deep, ingrained fear and mistrust that defines the world Ali is born into. The body swap at the center of the film carries enormous cultural weight as a storytelling device. The tradition of body swap narratives in literature and films stretches back centuries and appears in cultures all around the world, but its most powerful iterations have always used the premise not for simple comedy but for genuine social commentary. The experience of literally inhabiting another person's body, of seeing the world through their eyes and feeling it through their physical reality, is the most direct imaginable expression of empathy. Swap takes this tradition and places it within a world where two communities have been separated by fear and historical grievance for so long that they have completely lost the ability to understand each other's perspectives. The body swap forces Ollie and Ivy to do what their communities have not done for generations. It forces them to live inside the other's experience, to feel the vulnerability of the puku and the desperation of the Javan not as abstract facts but as lived physical reality. This resonates powerfully with a number of real historical and cultural phenomena. The civil rights movement in the United States, for example, produced some of its most effective communication through exactly this kind of perspective shift. Leaders and writers of that era often argued that the fundamental problem of racial prejudice was not simply hatred but a failure of imagination, an inability, or an unwillingness to truly inhabit the experience of another person's life. Literature, art, and storytelling were consistently identified as the most powerful tools available for cultivating that kind of imaginative empathy. Swap belongs to that tradition. It is making an argument, in animated form, that the path from division to understanding runs directly through the experience of genuine perspective-taking, and that this is not a passive or comfortable process. It is difficult, disorienting, and requires the abandonment of assumptions that feel fundamental to your identity. The character of the firewolf is culturally and historically significant in ways that deserve particular attention. The firewolf is the film's villain, but he is also something more complex and more interesting than a simple embodiment of evil. His origin story reveals that he was not born a monster. He was a tree wolf who experienced rejection by his own community, who was cast out by his pack and responded to that rejection with a destructive rage that ultimately consumed everything around him, and then consumed him as well. The Zo, recognizing that his rage was destroying the valley, contained him rather than killed him, which is itself a culturally significant choice. They transformed him into a fish, limiting his capacity for harm without ending his life, an act that reflects a particular kind of justice rooted in restraint rather than punishment. The firewolf's backstory is a remarkably sophisticated treatment of how historical violence tends to originate. Very rarely in human history has large-scale destructive violence come purely from nowhere, from creatures or people who are simply evil by nature. Far more often, the patterns of historical trauma, oppression, and community-level violence can be traced back to experiences of rejection, marginalization, and pain that were responded to with rage rather than healing. This does not excuse the violence. The film is very clear that the firewolf's destruction was catastrophic and wrong, and that the valley has suffered enormously because of it. But by giving the firewolf a comprehensible origin, the film refuses the easy comfort of a villain who is simply evil, and it asks its audience to sit with a more complicated and more historically honest truth. The firewolf's declaration, his insistence that the valley should be ruled by fear again, is one of the film's most pointed pieces of cultural commentary. It reflects a pattern that historians and political scientists have documented across virtually every society in every era. There are always forces within a divided society that benefit from the maintenance of that division, that have a vested interest in keeping different communities afraid of each other rather than understanding each other, because fear is easier to manipulate than genuine connection. The firewolf represents those forces in an almost archetypal way. He is not simply a creature who wants to cause chaos. He is a creature who specifically wants to maintain the structures of fear and separation that give him power, because in a valley where different species communicate and cooperate, and understand each other, his particular kind of power has no purchase. The food crisis that drives much of the film's early plot is rooted in economic and ecological dynamics that have very real historical parallels. The Javans came to Puku Island not out of malice but out of desperate need, because the resources at their own home were running low and their community was dying. The Pukus perceived this as invasion and aggression, and in a narrow sense they were not wrong, Their resources were being taken and their community was suffering as a result. But both communities were responding to real material pressures rather than pure hostility toward each other, and the escalating conflict between them had at its root an ecological crisis that neither community had the tools to address together because they could not communicate with each other. This pattern is extraordinarily common in human history. A significant number of the world's most devastating conflicts, from colonial land seizures to modern refugee crises, have at their root a competition over resources driven by environmental or economic pressures that are then interpreted through the lens of cultural or racial or religious difference, transforming what might have been a shared problem into an intractable conflict. The concept of generational trauma runs through the entire film like a quiet current. The Puka's fear of the outside world, their rule of hide today alive tomorrow, is not irrational. It was developed in response to a genuinely dangerous event, the firewolf's rampage, and it kept the community alive through the dangerous period that followed. But by the time Ali is born, several generations after the original trauma, the fear has become disconnected from any specific present-day threat and has instead become a cultural identity in itself. Being a Puka means being afraid of the outside. Being a Puka means staying on the island. The rule is not questioned because questioning it feels like questioning who you are at the most fundamental level. This is one of the most accurate and culturally resonant depictions of intergenerational trauma in recent animated film. Traumatic events do not just affect the people who live through them. They reshape the cultural structures, the behavioral norms, and the emotional landscapes of entire communities for generations afterward, and they continue to do so long after the original threat has passed or changed. Ali's curiosity is culturally significant precisely because it represents a break in this intergenerational transmission of trauma. He is the member of his community who cannot simply accept the inherited fear without questioning it, not because he is reckless or foolish, but because something in him refuses to let the past determine the present without examination. This is a role that appears in the histories of virtually every society that has undergone significant cultural transformation. The individuals who initiate change are rarely the ones with the most power or the most security. They tend to be the ones who are constitutionally incapable of accepting the status quo as inevitable, who keep asking why things are the way they are when the community around them has stopped asking. The role of storytelling within the film is itself a culturally important element. Ali's grandmother's stories are the mechanism through which the valley's history is transmitted to the next generation, and this is historically accurate to how human cultures have always preserved and passed on their understanding of the past. Oral storytelling traditions exist in every culture on Earth and have served for millennia as the primary vehicle through which communities maintain their connection to their own history, their values, their identity, and their understanding of the world. The grandmother's role in the film, as the keeper and transmitter of the valley's story, reflects a pattern of elder wisdom and intergenerational knowledge that appears across indigenous cultures, African cultural traditions, South Asian storytelling practices, and virtually every other cultural framework that existed before the modern era. The film's ending, in which the Tzo return to the valley and the different communities begin the slow and imperfect process of reconnection, is not presented as a simple or complete resolution. The valley is not instantly healed. The fear and the history and the pain do not simply evaporate because the firewolf has been defeated. What changes is the possibility. The dam has been broken, both literally and metaphorically, and what was blocked can now flow again. This is a historically sophisticated understanding of how social healing actually works. It does not happen in a single dramatic moment of triumph. It happens slowly, imperfectly, one relationship at a time, built on the foundations laid by individuals who chose connection over fear before it was safe or easy or obvious to do so. The film also engages, in a sophisticated way, with questions about the nature of identity and what it means to belong to a community. When Ali is transformed into a Javan, he does not stop being a Puku. His identity, his memories, his values, his relationships, his sense of who he is, all of this remains entirely intact inside a body that looks completely different. The film uses this to make a point that is both philosophically interesting and culturally resonant. The physical markers by which different communities identify and distinguish themselves from each other, the visible signs of species or tribe or group membership, are not the same thing as the inner life, the values, and the character of the individual. Ali is still Ali whether he is a puku, a javan, a fish, or Edsel. The things that make him who he is are not housed in his external form. This is a gentle but clear argument against the kinds of surface-level categorization by which communities have historically judged and excluded one another. The production history of the film is also culturally significant in ways worth noting. Skydance Animation, the studio that produced the film, was building on a vision developed in collaboration with some of the most experienced voices in American animation, including John Lasseter and Nathan Greno, both of whom built their most celebrated work at Disney and Pixar. The fact that this film was produced partly through Skydance Animation Madrid, the studio's European division, means that it carries within it the influence of both American and European animation traditions and sensibilities. The integration of an original fantasy world with ecological and social themes reflects European animated filmmaking's long tradition of using fable and fantasy to engage with serious philosophical and political questions, a tradition that stretches from classic fairy tales through the golden age of European animated cinema and into the present. The score of the film, composed by Siddhartha Khosla, adds another layer of cultural dimension. Khosla is of Indian heritage, and his musical background draws on both Western orchestral traditions and South Asian musical sensibilities. His work on the film's score brings a textural richness and an emotional complexity that reflects the multicultural composition of the film's creative team and broadens the film's cultural resonance beyond the specifically American or European contexts that tend to dominate mainstream animated film production. Taken as a whole, Swapped is a film that is doing more cultural and historical work than its entertainment packaging might initially suggest. It is using the tools of commercial animation, voice casting, humor, adventure, and visual splendor to make arguments about empathy, historical trauma, generational fear, resource conflict, the nature of identity, and the possibility of social healing that are as relevant to the world of 2026 as they have ever been at any point in human history. In a cultural moment characterized by profound division, by communities talking past each other with increasing intensity, by the hardening of identities and the retreat into tribalism across virtually every corner of the world, a film that makes a sincere, emotionally intelligent, and narratively compelling argument for the possibility of understanding across difference is not just good entertainment. It is a cultural contribution of genuine value and meaning. The budget, making of Swapped, and funny moments from the set. Before getting into all the wild and entertaining behind-the-scenes stories from this production, it is worth addressing the budget question directly and honestly. Netflix, as a company, has a long-standing policy of not publicly disclosing the production budgets of its original films and series. This is true across the board, from their biggest live-action blockbusters to their animated productions, and Swapped is no exception to that rule. No official budget figure has been confirmed or released by Netflix or Skydance Animation for this film. However, based on what the industry knows about the cost of producing major studio-level 3D computer-animated feature films over a period of nearly 8 years, with 2 separate animation studio locations, a world-renowned director, a team of hundreds of animators and technical artists, and a voice cast filled with some of the most in-demand names in Hollywood, it is entirely reasonable to estimate that the total production cost of Swapped falls somewhere in the range of $100 to $150 million, possibly more when you factor in the extended development period that stretched all the way back to 2018. This is the kind of budget range that major animated films from studios like Pixar, DreamWorks, and Disney typically operate within, and Skydance Animation, with the full financial backing of David Ellison's Skydance Media and the distribution power of Netflix, was operating at that level of ambition. Netflix also would have spent a significant additional sum on marketing, promotion, and global distribution, which for a film of this profile would likely have added tens of millions of dollars more on top of the production cost itself. The film was originally developed under the title Powerless, and in its earliest form it had nothing to do with animal-plant hybrid creatures in a magical valley. The original concept that Nathan Greneau brought to Skydance Animation when he first signed his contract with the studio in 2018 was a story about teenagers with superpowers. It was a completely different kind of film, working in the genre of superhero and coming-of-age storytelling that had been enormously popular for years. Greneau spent considerable time developing that concept, building out the world and the characters and the story, before eventually reaching a moment where he sat down with John Lasseter, who had joined Skydance Animation in 2019, and told him with remarkable honesty that he thought they were making the wrong movie. This is an extraordinary moment in the production history of the film because it takes real creative courage for a director to walk into a meeting and tell one of the most powerful and experienced figures in animation history that the project they have all been investing time and energy into needs to be completely rethought from the ground up. Greneau told Lasseter that the story needed to be a transformation movie, that it needed to be genuinely about what it means to experience the world through another perspective, and that the way they were telling it was not capturing that with enough truth or depth. Lasseter, who has always had a deep commitment to research-driven storytelling rooted in his years at Pixar, responded with enthusiasm and pushed the creative team to dig deeper into the nature of empathy itself, not just as a theme but as a structural and emotional foundation for the entire film. What followed was a fundamental reimagining of the project. The teenagers with superpowers were gone. In their place came an entirely original world of animal-plant hybrids living in an ecosystem called the Valley, and at the center of it all was a tiny furry creature named Ollie and a magnificent bird named Ivy. The shift from human characters to entirely invented creatures was a deliberate and significant creative decision. Greneau recognized that animated films about humans transforming into animals had been made many times before, and he did not want to travel that well-worn road. By making both of the main characters entirely original species that existed nowhere in the natural world, the film could build its emotional and thematic universe without the audience drawing comparisons to other films they had seen. The world-building process for the Valley was one of the most intensive and detailed aspects of the film's production. Greneau and his creative team did not simply design creatures that looked interesting. They built an entire functional ecosystem from the ground up, working through questions that went far beyond what any audience member would ever consciously notice or think about while watching the finished film. They mapped out where the water came from. They worked out how the sun moved through the valley and what that meant for the different species who lived in different parts of it. They developed migration patterns for the fish and the walking plants and every other creature in the world. They studied real predator and prey relationships in nature, and used those dynamics as the foundation for the relationships between the species of the valley. Greneau has described this process as building a world where the ecosystem itself worked so logically and consistently that when it was functioning properly the audience could feel it, and when something disrupted it the audience could feel that too, even without consciously understanding why. The design process for the creatures themselves was another enormous undertaking. Every creature in the valley exists on a spectrum between plant and animal, which sounds like a simple enough idea but in practice required the design team to make thousands of decisions about how to balance those two elements in ways that felt visually coherent, emotionally expressive, and completely unlike anything seen in mainstream animation before. The puku, Ollie's species, had to look small and vulnerable and warm and endearing, with enough personality in their physical design to carry the emotional weight of the story. The Javans, Ivy's species, needed to communicate pride, power, and a kind of regal beauty that made their eventual vulnerability and desperation all the more surprising and moving. Every other creature in the valley, from the tree wolves to the root snakes to the rock bears to Boogle the fish, had to feel like it belonged organically to the same world while also being visually distinctive and memorable. The production was split across 2 locations. The primary studio work was done by Skydance Animation's team in the United States, with a significant portion of the animation executed by Skydance Animation Madrid, the studio's European division based in Spain, which was formerly known as Alien Animation Studios. This transatlantic collaboration added a layer of organizational complexity to the production that required careful coordination between teams working in different time zones, with different working cultures, and under different production conditions. A second group of animators was drawn from former employees of Blue Sky Studios, the Fox animation studio that had been shut down by Disney in 2021, whose talent had since scattered across the industry. Bringing this team together under the Skydance banner and integrating their skills and sensibilities with the broader production was one of the practical challenges of making the film, and the result was a visual aesthetic that reflected the combined strengths of these different animation traditions. The technical challenge at the absolute heart of the production was the body swap itself. When Ollie transforms into Ivy and Ivy transforms into Ollie, the animation team faced a problem that no amount of creative enthusiasm could make simple. The whole point of the body swap, narratively and emotionally, is that the audience needs to immediately understand which character they are watching even after the transformation has taken place. If a viewer loses track of who is Ollie and who is Ivy the moment the swap happens, the entire emotional architecture of the story collapses. The film depends completely on the audience being able to look at a Javan and know they are watching Ollie, and look at a Puku and know they are watching Ivy. Some members of the production crew were genuinely concerned that this would not be achievable, that the moment the characters changed bodies the emotional connection would be lost irreparably. Greenough and the animation team worked through this problem by identifying the specific physical details that would carry each character's identity across the transformation. Eye color became one of the primary anchors. Both characters retained their distinctive eye color even when their bodies changed completely, giving the audience a visual cue that connected them across species. Facial structure was another element the team studied carefully, looking at how to preserve enough of each character's essential facial geometry within the proportions of a completely different creature type to make the recognition feel immediate and natural rather than effortful. Beyond the physical design, the animators focused on behavioral details, the specific ways each character moved, the particular rhythms of their gestures and their expressions, and they built those behavioral signatures into the animation of the swapped forms so that Ollie still moved like Ollie even inside a Javan's body, and Ivy still moved like Ivy inside a Puka's body. It was an extraordinary technical and artistic achievement, and it was the kind of problem that could only be solved through collaboration, experimentation, and a willingness to throw out solutions that were almost right and keep pushing until something was fully right. Now, when it comes to the funny and memorable moments that happened during the production, particularly during the voice recording sessions, the stories that have come out from the cast and crew are genuinely entertaining. Perhaps the single funniest and most unexpected element of the entire voice recording process was what Nathan Greenough had to do to make the chemistry between Michael B. Jordan and Juno Temple work on screen. In an ideal world, animated voice recording involves getting the lead actors in the same booth at the same time so that they can actually respond to each other in real time, building the natural rhythm of a genuine conversation rather than each actor performing into a void and hoping the editor can make it feel like they were talking to each other. Greenough wanted exactly this for Swapped, particularly because the relationship between Ollie and Ivy is so central to the film, and so dependent on the feeling of genuine back-and-forth connection. He planned from the beginning to have Michael B. Jordan and Juno Temple record their scenes together, in the same booth, playing off each other directly. The reality of working with two of the most in-demand actors in Hollywood at the peak of their careers made this plan essentially impossible to execute consistently. Michael B. Jordan and Juno Temple are both extraordinarily busy people with schedules that are planned months in advance, and rarely align with the scheduling needs of an animated film production. Getting them in the same room at the same time proved to be, as Greenough put it himself, a significant challenge. So when it became clear that they were going to have to record separately most of the time, Greenough came up with a solution that is both clever and genuinely hilarious when you picture it. He decided that he himself would stand in for whichever actor was absent. When he was recording Michael B. Jordan, he would play the role of Juno Temple, reading all of Ivy's lines in the booth with Jordan so that Jordan had a real performance to respond to. And when he was recording Juno Temple, he would play the role of Michael B. Jordan, delivering all of Ollie's lines for Temple to work with. Nathan Greenough, the director of the film, was essentially performing as both Juno Temple and Michael B. Jordan in alternation throughout the recording process, and by his own description this involved bringing everything that Juno had given him in her sessions into the booth with Michael, and everything Michael had given him into the booth with Juno. Trying to recreate the energy and specificity of each actor's performance well enough that the other actor could genuinely respond to it. The image of Nathan Greenough, a tall American man who has spent his career directing Disney and Skydance animation productions, standing in a recording booth doing his best impression of Juno Temple for Michael B. Jordan's benefit, and then turning around and doing his best impression of Michael B. Jordan for Juno Temple's benefit, is one of the more entertainingly undignified things that a major animated film director has done in the name of getting the right performance out of his actors. Greenough himself has spoken about this with great humor and self-awareness, acknowledging that his impression of Juno Temple was probably not winning any awards but that it served its purpose in giving Michael something real to react to in the moment. Tracy Morgan's recording sessions for the character of Boogle became something of a legend within the production for a completely different reason. Tracy Morgan is, by every account of everyone who has ever worked with him in any professional context, completely and utterly unpredictable in the best possible way. He does not approach performance in the conventional sense of learning his lines and delivering them as written. He approaches it as an opportunity to go wherever the creative energy of a moment takes him, and the place that energy takes him is frequently somewhere that no one in the room anticipated. The animators who had been brought into the recording sessions to observe and collect material for the character were reportedly kept on their feet throughout Morgan's time in the booth, because he would veer off script in directions that were so unexpected and so genuinely funny that the whole room would dissolve into laughter, at which point the recording would have to stop while everyone recovered enough to continue. Morgan's natural approach to the character of Boogle was to play him with a kind of cheerful, slightly bewildered forthrightness, a personality that seemed completely at peace with situations that would send any reasonable creature into a panic. This translated beautifully to the screen because Boogle's apparent harmlessness and friendliness is the character's primary function for most of the film. He needs to seem utterly unthreatening. He needs to seem like the most well-meaning, if slightly dim, helpful fish in any body of water. Morgan achieved this not by restraining himself or playing the character small but by simply being Tracy Morgan in a recording booth, which is by nature something that radiates warmth, energy, and a particular kind of lovable chaos that the character of Boogle absolutely required. Cedric the Entertainer's sessions for Kalu, Ollie's father, were reportedly some of the warmest and most emotionally rich in the entire production, but they were also some of the most likely to go completely sideways into extended improvisational comedy that had nothing to do with the scene at hand. Cedric is a performer whose natural mode is to find the humor in any situation, and the situation of standing in a recording booth performing as the father of a cartoon otter while a room full of animators and sound engineers stared at him through the glass apparently presented him with a great deal of material. He has a gift for making the people around him laugh at moments when they are absolutely supposed to be staying professional and focused, and this gift was reportedly exercised frequently during his sessions on Swapped. The dung smearing scene, in which Ollie is coated in dung to mask his scent from a tree-wolf predator, was apparently a recurring source of entertainment throughout the production. The animators working on the scene had to figure out how to depict this particular event in a way that was appropriate for a PG-rated family film, funny without being gross in ways that would alienate younger audiences, and physically coherent given the specific proportions and capabilities of the creatures involved. The fact that Ivy's line upon recognizing what kind of creature Ollie's name referred to, the observation that the word puku has the word poo in it, made it through the entire production process and into the final film is a reflection of the fact that the filmmakers were not above a well-placed juvenile joke when it served the comedic needs of the moment. Greneau has spoken in interviews about the culture within the production being one of genuine creative openness and collaboration, which is something he values deeply and which stands in some contrast to the more hierarchical production environments he experienced during his 22 years at Walt Disney Animation Studios. At Disney, the pipeline was extremely well defined. There were established processes for every stage of production, clear expectations about how decisions were made and who had authority over what, and a system that had been refined over decades into something that was enormously efficient but also, by the nature of its structure, somewhat rigid. At Skydance, Greneau was building something rather than stepping into something already built, and that required a different kind of leadership. He has described his approach to directing as fundamentally about setting a clear vision and then getting out of the animators' way and letting them do their best work. He is openly modest about the limits of his own technical skills, acknowledging freely that he is not the best animator or the best layout artist on his own productions, and that this is completely fine because great directors do not need to be the best at every technical skill. What they need to be is the best at seeing the whole picture, at understanding what the story needs emotionally at every moment, and at communicating that understanding to a team of hundreds of people working in multiple departments across multiple locations over multiple years. Greneau's background, which includes work on Mulan, Bolt, Treasure Planet, and Tangled before he ever got to Skydance, gave him the experience to manage that kind of complexity with enough confidence to keep the production moving forward even through the significant creative overhaul that happened partway through development. The film had an unusual journey in terms of its distribution. It was originally developed with Apple TV Plus as the intended platform. Apple had greenlit the project in July 2022 under the title Puku, and for a period of over a year, the film was being made as an Apple original. Then in October 2023, everything changed. Netflix struck a new multi-year deal with Skydance Animation that included taking over the distribution rights for several of the studio's upcoming projects, and Puku, which would eventually become Swapped, was transferred to Netflix as part of that deal. This kind of mid-production platform switch is unusual and somewhat disruptive, requiring adjustments to various aspects of the production and marketing approach, but it ultimately landed the film on the world's largest streaming platform, giving it global reach from the moment of its premiere on May 1, 2026. The title change from Puku to Swapped, which was confirmed publicly in October 2025, was itself the subject of considerable discussion both within the industry and among the animation community. Puku was a more specific and unusual title, deeply connected to the world of the film and its particular invented mythology. Swapped is simpler, more immediately communicative about the central premise of the body swap story, and arguably more marketable to a general audience who might not know what a puku is. The decision to go with Swapped reflects a pragmatic understanding of how mainstream animated films need to position themselves in a crowded marketplace, even if some of the creative team and animation fans felt some attachment to the original title. The film had its first public screening at the Sebastiani Theater in Sonoma, California, on January 9, 2026, several months before its official global premiere. This preview screening was a significant event for the production team, representing the first time a general audience would see and respond to the film that had been in development and production for the better part of 8 years. The response at Sonoma was reportedly warm and enthusiastic, giving the creative team their first real confirmation that the film they had spent so long making was connecting with audiences in the way they had hoped. The film's score, composed by Siddhartha Khosla, was another significant element of the production. Khosla worked closely with Greneau throughout the process, developing musical themes that could carry the emotional arc of the story across its different tones, from the warmth and wonder of the valley's world building in the opening act to the tension and danger of the tree wolf encounters in the middle of the journey to the genuine heartbreak and heroism of the film's final act. The score has been noted by several reviewers as one of the film's genuine strengths, providing an emotional through line that helps the audience navigate the story's more demanding moments. Tim Mertens, who edited Wreck-It Ralph in 2012, was brought on as the film's editor, and his experience with animated features of significant emotional complexity was clearly a valuable asset to the production. The editing of an animated film is a different kind of challenge from live-action editing because the editor is working with material that has been painstakingly created frame by a large team of animators, and every change to the cut has implications for the workload of the animation department. Getting the pacing right, finding the rhythm of each scene, and making decisions about what to keep and what to cut requires both a deep understanding of the story and a sensitivity to the enormous human effort that went into creating every single second of footage. The film screened at the Annecy Animation Festival in June 2025, where a second look at the film's animation was revealed to the international animation community for the first time. Annecy is the most prestigious animation festival in the world, and having a presence there gave SWAP significant visibility within the industry and generated excitement among animation professionals and enthusiasts globally ahead of its 2026 release. Taken all together, the making of SWAP is a story about creative courage, unexpected pivots, transatlantic collaboration, a director performing impressions of major Hollywood actors in a recording booth, Tracy Morgan doing things in a recording booth that made the entire room lose their composure on a regular basis, and an animation team that spent years solving problems that had never been solved quite this way before. It is a production that reflects everything that is both exhilarating and genuinely difficult about making an ambitious animated film from scratch, and the result, whatever its critical reception, is a film that carries within it the evidence of the enormous commitment of everyone who worked on it for so long.